All right. So as everyone knows, we're going to be doing the continuation of the live stream I did with John on Roy Cheli. That in that stream I didn't get to express everything, and after the stream I found more than enough new evidences or proofs or more things to add within the slides. So I'm going to be recording this. I expect this presentation in the video to be about 4 hours, so I'm going to be recording it in pieces, and I will paste it together afterwards. And so far, there's about 169 slides. I expect there, after I'm done with the presentation, to be about 200. So today, I'm gonna go, hopefully, aim for about 50 slides, if not. But today, we are doing a presentation, or I'm doing a presentation on statuary in the Orthodox Catholic Church. I'm going to be going over some patristic history, canonicity, and usages within the church. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to first, we're going to go over our goals and a lot of the things that we're not here to do. To give a fair and reasonable defense for the use of statuary within Western Rite Orthodoxy, to give historical context to the use of statuary in the church, to familiarize the audience with how the church of the first 1,000 years viewed statuary in a liturgical setting and in general. In general, I mean, prayer corners, whether inside or outside, whether they believe that they are religious objects or solely historical monuments, I guess you could say. And we're going to show the viewers how the use of statuary conforms with biblical patterns of worship in the same way that Orthodox liturgies conform with the worship in the temple. Which is a very common sort of argument point against a lot of Protestants, is that our worship conforms with the Bible and is very, very similar to the way that God was worshipped in the temple, with the mitre that the Old Testament high priest wore in his garbs. And you always hear Protestants, oh, you guys wear long dress, you look like girls. Well, God kind of commanded that sort of thing. So we're also near the end of the presentation. I'm going to apply and do a treatise on the proper theological interpretations for a statuary in the context of Western Rite Orthodoxy. We're also not really here to influence the modern Byzantine Rite, although I think you can come away with a lot of ideas as to how the Byzantines, or the people who celebrate the Byzantine Rite within the Orthodox Church, viewed statuary throughout the history, especially in places like Russia. And we are not here to defend the usage of statuary by any other particular church. Things like naked women on massive high altars, or Christ literally having 1,000,000 gashes and being bloody and looking unalive and dead and looking as if he is weak. We don't, that's not what we're here to support. I'm not here to support the papal cross, which Pope Francis carries around, which is extremely demonic looking because he's hanging. It's that stuff I'm not here to defend. I don't in any way want to be associated with that. And there are some exceptions which I will be giving examples and defending, including statuary which arose in parts of the Gothic and Romanesque periods, which I do believe conform with the earlier Carolinian and even Byzantine periods within Roman worship. I'm going to hold the view, at least for this this presentation, even though it's not really integral to the presentation, that I don't really believe that these usage is within the Romanesque and early Gothic periods were a heretical move against Orthodoxy, again, because the last patriarchate to break from Rome was in the 13th century. I believe it was 1250 when Bulgaria broke schism with Rome. So that is generally what we're going to go over. And the first section we're going to move on to is statuary as a necessary component for worshiping God in the Old Testament. And as we know, in Exodus, it states, you shall make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2.5 cubits long and 1.5 cubits wide, and you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Make them hammered works at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end and 1 cherub at the other. You shall make the cherubim one piece with the mercy seat at 2 ends. And here we have actually a Carolinian Frankish church, which has the traditional Orthodox iconography and depiction of the Ark of the Covenant. And as we can see, on the Ark of the Covenant, statuary is made and carved upon it and covered with gold. Very symbolic, and I also want people to keep in mind that these are not suggestions of God, that these are commandments of God as to how he wishes to be worshipped. And I think that's extremely important and integral to the beginning of this argument. And ultimately, I think this argument alone sort of proves my point. But I think there are a lot more proofs as well. And here are some more traditional Orthodox depictions of the Ark of the Covenant and of the Old Testament worship. And here's a more modern rendition of what the Ark of the Covenant is believed to have looked like, with the High Testament priests, with the incense. And then we go to Chronicles, which is also a very great example where in the most holy house he made 2 cherubim of image work and overlaid them with gold. And the wings of the cherubim were 20 cubits long. 1 wing of the cherubim was 5 cubits, reaching to the wall of the house, and the other wing likewise 5 cubits, reaching to the other cherubim. And here's a artistic rendition of Solomon's temple. And here's another one. And he goes on to state, 1 wing of the other cherub was 5 cubits, reaching to the wall of the house, and the other wing was 5 cubits also, joining to the wing of the other cherub. These wings of these cherubims spread themselves 20 cubits, and they stood on their feet, and their faces were inwards. And here's another rendition, which I think is more accurate, because this is traditionally how we depict cherubim in iconography and within the church. And within the Byzantine Rite, we actually have these instructions laid out very similarly. Because, we have the Lord being crucified, the sacrifice in the center, and the 2 seraphim, sometimes they're seraphim, sometimes they're cherubim, on the right and left side of Christ. And this is very biblical. This is the way that it has been explicated in the altar fans on the Byzantine altar. And here are some more examples. And you'll notice a lot of the time that the altar fans are actually, a lot of the time, they're relief images, or even go this far as to be almost like flattened statues. Here's another example. In a basic definition from Wikipedia, fans of carved, gilded, or painted wood are also found. Fans are usually made in pairs. In the Byzantine Rite, the fans are carried by altar servers at all processions with the Eucharistic gifts in the Gospel book. And if you ever go to the liturgy, these are carried everywhere. Before the liturgy starts within my parish, they bring out the Gospel to be venerated. And usually there's a candle or altar fans, which are carried by altar servers and brought out into the narthex so the gospel can be venerated before the liturgy starts. And here we have St. Augustine's Orthodox Church, I believe it's in Denver, which is associated with Our Lady of St. Lawrence, the Benedictine Orthodox Monastery, where they actually have statues of 2 angels at the side of the altar, which I think this church is very beautiful. And this is a very good biblical explication of these doctrines within the rite. And I don't think ultimately it's any different than the Byzantine rite. I think it's the same thing, just explicated a little bit differently. And we're going to be going on to some examples from the essentially the English altar, which is from pre-Tridentine Reformed manuscripts on how to do the Mass. And within pre-Tridentine Rome, we see the same explication. And actually, a lot of these churches, which have these pillars and the curtains, which are obviously also from the temple, we see the curtains and the pillars also in the Byzantine rite. If you ever look up Byzantine templons before the iconostasis was added, they had a very similar thing. And it also comes from the ciborium design in Roman worship and in Byzantine worship, where they put a curtain across the ciborium. So this is a way that I think is a non-crazy, non-sort of weird Neoplatonic thing that we can find in pre-Tridentine Rome, which still arose while Orthodox patriarchates were in communion with Rome. And I do believe that we ultimately can sanctify a lot of these practices. As I believe it comes from the same source as the altar fans. And there's not really many articles or history of these statues. Ultimately, it could have been a pre-schism between Rome and Constantinople thing. But I haven't been able to find any resources. But I thought this would be a very good example of some of the things that we could adopt into Orthodox worship that were, say, post-schism, quote-unquote, but are not heretical and I think are good, ultimately. And here's another example. There are many historical English cathedrals which have English, they're called the English altars. If you ever look into, say, Anglican or early pre-Tridentine Roman worship, they're called English altars, and specifically used in the Sarum rite. And why you'll see a lot of affinity in the Western rite for Sarum is because it developed around the 10th century. But the thing is that England was even Orthodox after the break of communion with Constantinople. And there is even a saint which is venerated in the OCA officially and within Western Rite Orthodox named St. Edward the Confessor, who was King of England at the time, while all the bishops in England were still in communion with Constantinople. And this is also the period when the Our Lady of Walsingham miracle happened as well. And I think, again, that this rite is very compatible with Orthodoxy because of its sort of innate anti-papism, I guess you could say. It has an innate sort of orthodoxy to it. And if you've ever watched any of the Sarum Masses, they're very beautiful, and I think they have a lot of continuity within Christianity and Orthodoxy in general. And this is another one. It's sort of difficult to see, but there's another depiction of the angel right here on the English altar. And again, we see templon-like structures which protect and cover the altar, which are distinct from rood screens, which would be farther out. But a lot of the time, they're not depicted in a lot of these illuminated manuscripts. Here's another example. And we see relief images on the back, the missal, iconography, and stained glass in the back. And we see the angels at the corners again, which is just from the construction of the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. Again, I think that a lot of this stuff is very easily sanctifiable and very compatible within Orthodoxy, and beautiful as well. And it seems as a whole, these sort of adopting these sort of practices seems to be very popular within Western Rite Orthodoxy as a whole. And even more, I like this one a lot, and they have 6 this time. And next, we're going to be going into the basics of usage of statuary in the early church, because there actually are examples. They're not that common, and my argument isn't based on whether or not, they're common, but they are present in the early church, and there are even patristic quotes from that period. But first we're going to go to the Catacomb Church of St. Agatha. It is in Malta. It has a long history, but it is from dates from the 2nd to 3rd centuries. And here we can see an altar statue, which I don't know that it's known who is actually depicted in the statue, which is put in. It's almost like a diptych, and it is carved out. But this is a early example of statues, and even an early example of altar statues, or high altars, I guess you could say them. They're not the same as the modern Roman Renaissance high altars, but this is an example of one of those. And here we have some of the other iconography which is present within St. Agatha's catacombs, which looks very similar, actually, to a lot of synagogue iconography. If you've ever looked into 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century synagogue iconography, in mosaics, they a lot of the time have plants and animals and even people and biblical events on the mosaic floors a lot of the time, which is, I believe, to be very beautiful and shows a lot of continuity. But within this church, it was kept up until the 14th century, and then I believe in the 60s it had been redug up, and people have been putting in efforts to restore it. So some of the paintings or the icons are from the 14th century, but they are there to protect or to redo damage that was already done. But as you can see, there's still a lot of damage that was done in wear and tear. There's a close-up of some of the iconography and imagery. And here's some more iconography and palettes with prayers on them and things like that. And these were most likely from the 14th century and put there to reconstruct and to recreate and to maintain what was already there. But this is the original. This is a 3rd century iconography, I guess you could say. And here is some of the more modern reconstructions and redoings, where we see a relief image, which this is all originally based off what was already there, but a lot of the parts of the catacomb were buried. And here's a close-up of the statue, which I personally think to be St. Paul, but there's no info, at least in English, that says who this statue is. And next we're going to go to some examples of statues that were used in a sort of home situation rather than a liturgical instance. But there are multiple statues that were used or created of Christ and of Jonah and the whale, and again of Christ, found mostly in Asia Minor, now modern-day Turkey, and were used in different contexts, mainly home prayer type situations, and some of them are unclear, but they are present, and are obviously based off of Roman sculptures at the time. But with the other statues, I'm simply these are not arguments. I'm not arguing that these are liturgical or that these support liturgical statues, but to get the sort of viewer used to the idea that statuary in general was not a looked down upon or quite a quote-unquote taboo thing within the early church or orthodoxy in general. Because, again, we see multiple of these examples. And it also sort of illustrates how Christ is the fulfillment of all religions, and especially when, say, St. Maximus talks about logi, and that all things are one in Christ ultimately. And even when we have the story of the 3 Zoroastrian wise men because even their religion taught that there was supposed to be some sort of Messiah figure. And I think it shows that Christ is sort of the fulfillment of all. And we see Christ depicted beardlessly in these statues because he's depicted as the emperor, and traditionally the Roman emperor would shave, and he's depicted as sort of a handsome young man, to glorify him. And he's, it's Christ the teacher is the sort of type of a statue or a presentation, I guess you could say, which again I think illustrates the fact that Christ fulfills all. But here is a statue that was used in a liturgical context, which was put in its own sort of corner within the catacombs of Domitilla in Rome, which is sort of a very common example we find. But this, again, is a Roman-type sculpture now used in a liturgical context, which actually takes from a pagan scene. I can't recall exactly which god was also commonly depicted in statues this way. But again, it shows the fact that, especially in Roman worship, Christian worship in the early church, that it was not looked down upon. And I personally believe that they would have seen it as Christ conquering Rome, and again, Christ fulfilling all of the religions, all of the false religions. Again, because you can't have a false religion that doesn't teach any truth, or it's just not appealing. And next we have another very interesting example, which is the sarcophagus of Junius Basius, placed in Old St. Peter's Basilica in 559 to, and it was created in 359 to 89, which is very interesting because we see sort of the border of statuary and relief images being pushed, because as we can see, these are almost freestanding. In here we have the entry into Jerusalem and St. Peter and Paul at the sides of Christ, and it may be Adam or Satan at the bottom on the left, I don't know, but they are almost freestanding, as you can see. And ultimately I think any distinctions that are really made by people between relief images and statuary are sort of extremely arbitrary. So for this video in general, I'm going to say, just for practical purposes, that our sort of definition of statue is going to be something that is by surface area has less than 50% contact with the surface. I know that's sort of, again, arbitrary and vague, but for all practical purposes, we're going to use that. But I ultimately don't think that relief images and statuary have any real hard distinction. But this was a sarcophagus, and if anyone knows history of worship, especially in Rome, in the early church, they actually used the sarcophagi as altars, which I find very interesting, because obviously this is going to be a sort of liturgical object, and this is the source of, within Orthodoxy in general, why we have relics in the altar, whether it be, hands, jewelry, X, Y, and Z from saints. You can find, the dead body parts of certain saints in some altars, which I think is beautiful, because of the resurrection, because of, the holiness of certain saints, and the sort of defeating of death by Christ, and the ascension into Hades, and things like that. I thought this was an interesting example and a good time for me to bring up sort of the fact that I don't really believe there's too much of a distinction between relief image carvings and statues. And next we're going to go to a quote by Eusebius in church history, where he records a miracle-working statue of Christ, which was made and commissioned, I believe it was in bronze, by a wealthy woman. And I have the link on the top left because it's quite a lengthy story. But the story goes that she had resurrected is actually the great term, this statue in front of her house, and An herb under it had grown, and this herb had miraculously healed people who had certain illnesses. And people started to venerate the statue and to make pilgrimages to it, and it started to, again, work miracles, until it was destroyed by one of the local, I guess, Roman governors, I guess they're called. I don't remember exactly the term. But this is recorded in Eusebius in church history, and we'll even have to mention this near the end of the presentation, because this is also brought up in the rudder. But again, I'm going to make these slides public so you can click on any of the links to get full context. If I were to read this whole thing, this video would be 20 hours long. And the next thing we're going to go through is St. John of Damascus and his apologia against those who decry holy images. And this is where he records the life of St. Basil. So this was written in the 6th century, 6th, 7th century. But this event occurred because it was actually from a student of St. Basil. And there is some confusion in the last live stream because it seems to state that there was an image of Macarius painted upon an image of the Theotokos. But in every translation I can see, it does say statue right here. I'll read it out, and if you guys still don't think it's convincing, that's fine. But in every translation I've ever found of this specific quote, it says the same thing, in all scholarly translations that I've been able to find. Listen to what I'm going to say as proof that images are no new invention. It is an ancient practice well known to the best and foremost of the fathers. Eladios, the disciple of Blessed Basil, and his successor, says in the life of Basil that the holy man was standing by an image of Our Lady, on which was painted also the likeness of Macarius, the renowned martyr. He was standing by it and asking for the removal of an impious apostate named Julius, and he received this revelation from the statue. He saw the martyr vanish for a time, and then reappeared holding a bloody spear. Again, I know it seems to be saying that there, by which was also painted the likeness of Macarius. It could just simply mean that the statue was painted, or there might be a comma on which was painted. The comma may have to be here, but in every translation I've seen it says statue. And next we will move on. And this is, I don't know if anyone would necessarily consider this a statue, but also if you look into the life of St. Basil, there's the practice of hanging a Eucharistic dove from the back pillar of the ciborium in the church, and to sort of enthrone the host in a golden dove. And again, please open the slides and read all of the links in which I have cited. But this is sort of an example of, I guess you could say, statues of the Holy Spirit, but also the dove is sort of a symbol. And I think it also sort of points out the fact that the sort of banning on the image of the dove outside of the baptism is not really... You don't find it in the church, because you can even find images of the Holy Spirit from, Rome in the 10th century. And before that and after that, it's sort of never been a sort of Orthodox doctrine just not to depict the dove out of in any other way. You see it sort of everywhere. In the Roquefort Chapel, the Roquefort Church that I attend, they celebrate in a chapel, and which has it as well. I think it's beautiful, and I don't see necessarily an issue with it. But moving on, this is sort of an example of 3D imagery, which was considered sanctified and used in the life of St. Basil. Whether or not you consider it a statue, whatever, but I think it's interesting to bring this up. And next we're going to go to St. John Chrysostom's Homily 10 on Ephesians, which everyone knows is his liturgy is celebrated in most parishes on Sunday. There are a few that still celebrate James or Basil on Sunday. But this is going to be a quote, and I will read you guys the quote. You have oftentimes been present at the burning of large houses. You have seen how the smoke keeps rising up to heaven. And if no one comes near to put a stop to the mischief, but everyone keeps looking to himself, the flame, indeed, as specters of the evil, not to aid nor to assist. I read that wrong. The flame spreads freely on and devours everything, and oftentimes the whole city will stand around, and they will stand round indeed as spectators of the evil, not to aid nor assist. And there you may see them, one and all standing round, and doing nothing, but each individual stretching out its hand and pointing out to someone who may just come to the spot, either a flaming brand, that movement flying through a window, or beams hurled down, or the whole circuit of the walls forced out and tumbling violently to the ground. Many too there are, the more daring and virtuousome, who have the hardihood even to come close to the very buildings themselves while they are burning, not in order to stretch forth hands towards them and to put a stop to mischief, but that they may the more fully enjoy the sight, being able from the nearer place to observe closely all that which often escapes those at a distance. If the house happen to be large and magnificent, it appears to them a pitiable spectacle, and deserving of many tears. And truly there is a pitiable spectacle for us to behold. Capitals of columns crumbled down to dust, and many columns themselves shattered to pieces, some consumed by fire, others thrown down, often the very hands which erected them, that they may add fuel to the flame. Statues again, which stood with so much gracefulness, with the ceiling resting on them, those you may see all exposed with the roof torn off, and themselves hideously disfigured with open air. And why should one go on to describe the wealth stored up within, the tissues of gold and vessels of silver, and where the lord of the house and his consort scarcely entered? Where was the treasure house of tissues and perfumes, and the caskets of costly jewels? All has become one blazing fire, and within now, the bathmen and street cleaners, and runaway slaves, and everybody and everything within, is one mass of fire and water, mud and dust, and all half-burnt beams. Now, why have I drawn out such a full picture as this? Not simply because I wish to represent to you the conflagration of a house, for which concern is that of mine, but because I wish to set before your eyes as vividly as I can the calamities of the church. For like the conflagration, or like a thunderbolt hurled from the high, have they lighted upon the roof of the church, and yet they rouse up no one. But while our Father's house is burning, we are sleeping, as it were a deep and stupid sleep. And yet who is there whom this fire does not touch? Which of the statues that stand in this church? For the church is nothing else than a house built for the souls of us men. Now this house is not of equal honor throughout, but the stones of which contribute to it. Some are bright and shining, while others are smaller and more dull than them, and yet superior again to others. There we may see many who are in the places of gold also. The gold which adorns the ceiling, Others we may see who give beauty and gracefulness produced by statues. Many we may see standing like pillars, for he is accustomed to call men also pillars. And he quotes Galatians 2:9. Not only on account of their strength, but we also on account of their beauty, adding as they do much grace, and having on their heads overlaid with gold. We may see a multitude forming generally the wide middle space and whole extent of their surfaces, for the body at large occupies the place of stones, of which the outer walls are built. Or rather, we must go to a more splendid picture yet. This church of which I speak is not built of these stones, such as Did I ever say that? Such as we see around us, but of gold and silver and of precious stones. And there's an abundance of gold dispersed everywhere throughout it. But oh, the bitter tears this calls forth. For all these things has the lawless rule of vainglory consumed, and that all-devouring flame which no one has yet got under. And we stand gazing in amazement at the flames, but no longer able to squench the evil, nor if we do not quench it for a short time, after 2 or 3 days, as a spark blown up from the heap of ashes overturns all, and consumes no less than it did before. So it is here also, for this is just what it is wont to happen in such a conflagration. And as to cause, it has devoured the supports of the very pillars of the church. Those of us who support the roof and who formerly held the whole building together, it has enveloped in the flame, hence to a ready communication to the rest of the outer walls. For so also in the case of buildings, when the fire lays hold of the timbers, it is better armed for its attack upon the stones. But when it has brought down the pillars, leveled them with the ground, nothing more is wanted to consume all the rest in the flames. But when the props and the supports of the upper parts fall down, those parts also themselves will speedily enough follow them. Thus it is also this moment with the church. The fire has laid down hold on every part. We seek the honors that come from man's. We burn for glory, and our heart ache not to Job. And he goes on, and it goes on and on. But to give a short summary, if you read the whole context, and this is just a very short, I know it doesn't seem very short quote from his homily 10 on Ephesians. But to what is important for this particular video is that he is describing the burning down of a church. And he is creating a simile of the church being burnt down with issues within the body of Christ, of issues within the body of Christ, the church, of people. And he is making a comparison, a very, I don't know if you could say hyperbolic, but a very, a presentation of words that is very imagery-based, where he is describing the burning down of the church, and we have the imagery of all of the pillars and walls and statues, most importantly for this stream, being destroyed. And he's making simile between statues, which are adorned in gold and stand like pillars within the church, and of humans. And I think particularly he is speaking of statues as maybe clergy, and how they are adorned with gold, yet he goes on to say that stones, some are beautiful within the church, and others are not. But just because one is prettier or more adorned in gold, it doesn't mean that anyone is less filled in grace because one looks different. And I think this is a very, very poetic passage within St. John Chrysostom, but also sort of illustrates the fact that statues were at one point used to glorify churches. And again, we see this term, adorned with gold, which we also see in the Old Testament when we're speaking of the construction of the Ark of the Covenant or of Solomon's Temple, which ultimately, when it comes down to it, I think obviously it symbolizes the divine glory radiating and reflecting off of gold. Because if you turn out the lights in a room, you can't see the gold, you can't see the reflection. But when the divine light is turned back on, when you light the candles in the room, it reflects off of it. The gold is a reflection, which I think perfectly illustrates the Orthodox doctrine of the energies. Again, I think is very beautiful. I think this has perfect continuity with the Old Testament. All right. And next, we're going to be getting to some more statues that were used in a liturgical context within a monastery, which is in Sardinia, and these were sadly put up for auction, secular auction, which I don't like. But there are two examples that I was able to find of these. And here's another one. And again, ancient early Christian small sculpture, or I guess you could call it an effigy, in tufa dated back to the 7th to 8th century AD, depicting the Madonna with child, and it is of Italian origin, and is probably from the catacombs of the ancient Isle of Solsis and San Antico, today in Sardinia. So on and so forth. And we see the crowned virgin holding the Christ child, which is very common in Orthodox iconography today. And next we're going to be going to the period of iconoclasm, and the patristic period of iconoclasm. And we're going to be going into the letter of Leo III and Saint Pope Gregory II's response to that letter. And if any of you know anything about iconoclasm or have looked into it, Leo III was the Byzantine emperor at the time who supported iconoclasm. And at the time, the only patriarchate that had iconography left as a doctrine in the sort of most intense period of iconoclasm was Rome, because the Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, all of these patriarchates, even the Monophysite patriarchates at the time, had been riddled with iconoclasm because they are under the Byzantine rule. And I'll go over the quote, and you guys can go on New Advent and other sources to find this quote. The Pope at the time was Pope St. Gregory II. Even before he had received the appeal of St. Germanus I of Constantinople, a letter came from the emperor commanding him to accept the edict, destroy images at Rome, and summon a general council to forbid their use. Gregory answered in 727 by a long defense of the images. He explained the difference between them and idols. And even within, if you read the full quote, he even goes in to go and speak about the same quotes we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, where God commands statuary to be made, which is very interesting. And he describes the lawful use and the reverence paid to images by Christians. He blames the emperor's interference in ecclesiastical matters and his persecution of quote-unquote image worshippers. A council is not wanted. All Leo has to do is to stop disturbing the peace of the church. As for Leo's threat, he will come to Rome and break the statue of St. Peter, which is inferred to be the famous bronze statue of St. Peter in St. Peter's Basilica, and to take the Pope prisoner. And Pope St. Gregory answers it by pointing out the fact that he can easily escape into Pagana, and reminding the emperor how futile and now abhorrent to all Christians was the Constans persecution of Martin I. And next we'll go to a very famous illustration of old St. Peter's Basilica, because as everyone knows now, new St. Peter's Basilica is a mess. It is adorned with Renaissance and Baroque period imagery and columns, and does not remain with its traditional form, which is Byzantine, is a Byzantine Romanesque form, which it would have had. And we actually see in this illustration on the right, we actually see the statue which is mentioned. And this statue is still present in Rome, I believe. There are secular scholars who say it is a later statue. May or may not be true. I sort of find it hard and unconvincing. But we see this again. In St. John Chrysostom's quote, he states, the statues were standing like pillars, and now we see statues on top of the pillars. I haven't been able to find too much information on how this painting was necessarily recreated, but again, I think it's very interesting to point these things out. And I really like the design of this painting a lot. And we see sort of in the Romanesque and Gothic periods these sort of things arising, again, which I think is orthodox and beautiful. And next we're going to be going over St. John of Damascus, where he writes in against those who decry holy images. And to give a short summary before I read this, and I'm terrible at reading because I don't even have my glasses on, and I hate reading out loud, but I'll do it anyways for the sake of this video. But he is writing against an iconoclast who does not believe in making images of saints, but of only Theotokos and Christ. And specifically, this iconoclast makes statues. And as we see, St. John of Damascus is going on to defend statues of the saints. But the adversary says, make an image of Christ and of his mother who bore him, and let that be sufficient. Oh, what a folly this is on your own showing. You are absolutely against the saints, for if you make an image of Christ and not of the saints, it is evident that you do not disown images, but honor of the saints. You make statues indeed of Christ as of one glorified, whilst you reject the saints as unworthy of honor, and call truth a falsehood. I live, says the Lord, and I will glorify those who glorify me. And he quotes 1 Samuel 2:30. And the divine apostle, therefore now he is not a servant, but a son. And if a son, an heir also through God. Again, if we suffer with him, and we also may be glorified. You are not waging war against images, but against the saints. St. John, who also rested on his breast, says that we shall be like him, just as a man by contact with fire becomes fire, not by nature, but by contact, and by burning, and by participation. It's also interesting. We see the essence-energy distinction. So it is, I apprehend, with the flesh of the crucified Son of God, that flesh by participation through union with the divine nature was unchangeably God, but in virtue of grace from God. Again, essence-energy distinction. As we, the cause with each of the prophets, by the presence of the fountainhead himself, God, the scripture says, stood in the synagogue of gods. So the saints, too, are gods in it. Holy Gregory takes the words, God stands in the midst of gods, to meet that he discriminates their several merits. The saints in their lifetime were filled with the Holy Spirit, and when they are no more, his grace abides in their spirits, and with their bodies in their tombs. Again, we see relics. And also with their likeness and holy image, not by nature, but by grace and divine power. God charged David to build him a temple through his son, and to prepare a place of rest. Solomon, in building the temple, made cherubim, as the Book of Kings says, and he encompassed the cherubim with gold, in all the walls in a circle. And he had the cherubim carved, and palms inside and out, in a circle, not from the sides, be it observed. And there were bulls and lions and pomegranates, and he quotes 1 Kings. It is not more seemingly to decorate all of the walls of the walls of the Lord's house with holy forms and images, rather than with beasts and plants. Where is the law declaring, "Thou shalt not make any graven images"? But Solomon, receiving this gift of wisdom, imaging heaven, made the cherubim in the likeness of bulls and lions, which the law forbade. Now, if we make a statue of Christ in the likeness of the saints, does not their being filled with the Holy Ghost increase the piety of our homage? As then the people in the temple were purified in blood and in burnt offerings. So now the blood of Christ giving testimony under Pontius Pilate, and being himself the first fruits of the martyrs, the church is built up on the blood of saints. Then the signs and forms of lifeless animals figured forth the human tabernacle, the martyrs themselves, who they were preparing for God's abode. Again, very interesting. We see him referring to the cherubim in the Old Testament and going on to state that if we make a statue of Christ in the likeness of the saints, does not their being filled with the Holy Ghost increase the piety of our homage? He goes on to refer to the statues in the Old Testament and states that statues of Christ and the saints are filled with the Holy Spirit. I think this is very significant for my argument, again, because St. John of Damascus is received at the Seventh Council. And his writings are now dogmatic and very commonly used within the Orthodox tradition to defend imagery. So I think this is very powerful. I think this is very beautiful. I think this is a great apologetic. And then again, all of the saints which I mentioned, we ask for the prayers and intercession of while doing this, so that we be brought to the truth. And here is some of the earlier examples of some Carolinian statuary, which again we see saints adorned with gold. Again, same imagery as the Old Testament. Very interesting looking. But this was in the Santa Fe Abbey church. And there is a link on the bottom from an arts journal, even though I don't consider it art, obviously, on the bottom. And here is a more interesting example, which this is one of my favorite examples, is the Volto Santo Crucifix. And this, let's go back. This was actually carbon dated and dates to about 100-year period they isolated it to, from 770 to 880 AD. And the tradition goes that in 742, Gautier, bishop of Subalpine, undertakes a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, arriving in Jerusalem. He has received in a dream the revelation of the place where the miraculous crucifix was hidden. Having found it, he decides to repatriate it to Italy by sea. The ship, I'm terrible, forgive me, and its precious load therefore left the holy city and headed unmanned to Luni, the point closest to Lucca. However, the inhabitants of Luni, known to be fierce wreckers, want to take the possession of the precious cargo, but they did not succeed because the vessel went back to sea each time they approached it. At the time in Lucca, Bishop John saw the arrival of the Volto Santo in a dream. He rushed to Luni, and the famous crucifix was immediately offered to him. Installed in the St. Martin Cathedral of Lucca, the Volto Santo crucifix then began to produce miracles that would make the city famous. Here we have some other images of it. And I think it's very interesting. Notice the arms are not sagging. And it's called the reigning from the cross position in Orthodox iconography. We don't see any sagging arms where Christ is, portrayed as weak, but we see the traditional depiction of Christ reigning and being sort of the ruler and king, I guess you could say, of the cosmos in this position, which I find very interesting and beautiful. Here are some other examples. They place the crown on the head, but taking away the crown, this is the rest of the crucifix. Also another interesting thing is we don't see the feet crossed, which is sort of a normal Orthodox depiction, even though we can find icons, say, from St. Catherine's Monastery in Jerusalem that produce, Byzantine icons which have a single nail. But again, we see sort of a traditionally Eastern, quote-unquote, tradition being explicated within statuary. Which, but here's another example, and here are some more photos of it. It's kept in a almost house type enclosure within the church, and here are some examples. It's sort of like a ciborium, but it has its own separate altar enclosed and protected within the church. Very interesting, very beautiful. And next we're going to move on to another example we see in very similar to St. Agatha's Catacomb, where we have this small, almost high altar, I guess you could say. It's a short altar, but an altar backing, and an altar up against a wall, which is sort of in contingency within the debate of Western Rite Orthodoxy as well. But we see a statue of the Theotokos in the position which she is without the Christ child, and is a Marion Altar, which is a Western tradition where you have a side altar where you have an altar dedicated to the Theotokos, which again is very beautiful. But we see the same position. Sometimes it's called the Theotokos of Comfort, but the icon is very popular because Saint Seraphim of Sarov had used this icon, and miracles had been worked through this icon many a times. We see lots of replicants. I have an icon which has this pose from Jordanville icons, which I think is very beautiful. And we see sort of relief images on the bottom, but I'll consider this one a statue. Yes, it is put in a sort of hollowed out area, but from all the photos that are available, it is a statue. It's less than 50% connected, so I'll consider it a statue. And this is from the 9th century, and we're going to give some other photos of St. Paulinaris Basilica, which is sort of a highlight of Roman Byzantine architecture. It's also a really good example of what Roman worship would have looked like in its sort of continuity with the Byzantine Rite, because they're very similar. The early Roman rites and Byzantine rites regarding architecture were very similar, and even vestments to an extent. And here we have an image of the altar before they removed the ciborium, because Rome likes to do that, and now they use the altar for the Novus Ordo. I hate it so much, but here's an example of greater context, and we can actually see the side altar with the side ciborium over here. And next we're going to go to some of the black Madonnas, which are sort of commonly brought up. But there is a feast to the statue in the middle, which is called Our Lady of Einsiedeln, which is German. And this basic story goes that it was created by an abbot of a monastery, but the monastery burnt down, and recreations have been made of it ever since. And there's actually a feast for the statue on the Antiochian and Rocor Western Rite calendars, I believe. And on the right, we also see the Virgin of the Rule, or Our Lady of Regla, or Virgina de Regla. And there's actually a shrine, which is an Antiochian Western Rite Orthodox Church in Miami, that is dedicated to her. And they actually have an altar statue of her, again, just like St. Agatha's Catacombs, or the previous relief image / statue in the sort of semi-high altar. And on the left is the Virgin of Monostrat, which is, according to tradition, came from Constantinople originally, but then was hidden in... I don't remember. It was in Constantinople. The tradition is that it came from Constantinople, and it's given its own altar. But a lot of the details are sort of fuzzy on a lot of these statues, and hence why I grouped them together. But very interesting. And again, there's a feast date for Our Lady of Einsiedeln on both of the calendars. And the next one I like a lot is the Madonna of Essen. The statue is usually dated around 980, so the 10th century, and was created during the tenure of Massidal. I don't know how to pronounce these names. A granddaughter of Emperor Otto I, and she was the abbess of Essen Abbey under her reign and those of her successors, Sophia of Gandersheim, from 1012 to 1039, and Theophano from 1039 to 1058. The abbey acquired what is today considered the most precious works of art in the Essen treasury. So this is a liturgical statue kept in the abbey, the monastery. And here are some examples. It's sort of now kept in a modernist way, which I don't like, obviously. But here's some close-ups. They put crowns on the statue. But again, we see the adorning with gold upon the statue. Again, same biblical imagery, again representing the divine light radiating off of the saints. And we see a cruciform halo again. I think this is very interesting and a good example of some Orthodox usage of statuary. And here's another one which is of a similar type that we see in Romanesque statuary. And it is the Virgin and Child enthroned. For the time, we know that it was made sometime before 1022, but is one of the oldest three-dimensional sculptures in medieval Latin West. This shimmering statue is an important earliest Matesta, or Virgin enthroned with the Christ Child. It was likely commissioned by Bishop Bernward. Cult figures such as this contributed to the veneration of the Virgin. Touched it in adoration during liturgical processions. It was also, according to a 1934 cathedral inventory, adorned with more than 1,000 broches, rings, and chains left as votive offerings. It has been broken, obviously, since. Some people have made recreations of what they thought it would look like, but this is another example of liturgical sculpture used. Alright, I am back to record the second part of this video, which I'm gonna have to do in like hour intervals. But next we're gonna go on to one of the other examples of statuary we will find within the pre-schism West. And these sorts of crucifixes are actually not that uncommon, where you have statuesque crucifixes within especially the Ottonian and within the Carolinian periods, especially in the Germanic parts of Europe. You even find them in parts of Norway and Finland and Sweden in old churches, which are most commonly made out of carved wood. But again, another example. And next we're going to be going to one of the most venerated statues within Orthodoxy as a whole, and a devotion which had occurred, or a vision which had occurred to a wealthy woman at the time when Saint Edward the Confessor, who is canonized by the OCA and who is venerated within Rocor and within Antioch and so on and so forth. And at the time, England was still in communion with Constantinople. And thus, even though this took place after the official quote-unquote schism date, this specific apparition occurred when England's bishops were still in communion with Constantinople. But we're going to go to the wiki page, because I'm a little bit lazy. And the story goes that there was a holy woman, a wealthier holy woman, who wanted to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy House. But she could not because of the obvious issues with the Islamic caliphates taking over the Holy Land. and thus she prayed, and the holy the Theotokos had constructed her in how to build a replica of the house, so she could have people make pilgrimages to it, so they could bring, almost like the Holy Land, back to England. And the story goes that she was constructed to make the house actually very similarly to the Ark, Noah's Ark, which is very interesting when you read the story. But she was also instructed to place a statue within the house. And this statue has had many replicas of it made, but it was destroyed during the Reformation. And thus we only have replicas left. But the replicas that we have now are made from replicas that were made of replicas when we still had the original. Which is very interesting, because this, a lot of the time, is very common, especially among Western Rite Orthodox within England. And there has been a monastery. There's a Rocor monastery, which the abbot died, which was dedicated to Our Lady of Walsingham. And there is a church today in Antioch, which still bears the name of Our Lady of Walsingham. But again, a very interesting event, and especially if you look at it, it's sort of looks just like Orthodox iconography that we see a lot of the time, which again shows a lot of continuity within the thought and within the iconographic statue tradition. Again. And after that, we're going to continue. And I, again, encourage people to look this up. I don't know that I need to provide any links, because this stuff's everywhere. And, I just show you the Ortho Wiki for that. And you can look at a bunch of other sites. And the site is, the house, I believe, still has a shrine built on it. Or at least on the lands that it was at the time. Next, we're going to go to the absolute multitudes of carvings and statuesque relief images we will find in Constantinople, which I find very interesting. And this is the normal result you'll see if you pull up, Orthodox statues. But this is an example that you'll find. But little did I know, there are many, many, many examples of Constantinople's ivory work. And a lot of these ivory works are sort of in between statue and relief image, and some I would just consider statues which are bound and put in a sort of carved out reservoir, I guess you could say. But this is an example, which is, I believe it's also, there may be a similar statue, which is in the Vatican, which they have in a museum. And according to all of the articles they've said, it was most likely put in a diptych with, obviously, if you've seen an Orthodox diptych, it has like the folds around, almost like a tabernacle. If you've ever seen the altar tabernacle, which I think again shows that the view of the church has always been that they are icons, or at least a type of icon, which is the sort of interpretation that I take as well. And here's another example. If something it borders statuary, we get a sort of, it's not really clearly defined whether or not it's an enclosed statue or relief images. But I think we can all agree that it is an icon. And here we have some side views showing that they're pretty much free when it comes to the back of them, which, again, I find so interesting. And again, with traditional Orthodox symbolism, which we see today, which is so interesting because a lot of the crucifixion icons we have, where there's Adam at the base of the cross, or usually his skull a lot of the time. And we even see that on like the scheme among vestments. Yeah. And here's a more interesting example, and this is actually from the 4th century. And this is a relief image carving. Some of them you can consider relief, and the ones up front are definitely statues of an event where the emperors would come in bringing essentially bishops and relics and chariots and so on and so forth. So it was a sort of like if you've ever seen any medieval movies where the king comes in with the bishops on a horseback carriage, and he's going around parading himself. And there's some debate as to who this is depicting, but the normal, most coherent explanation as to where this is from points to it being Constantine and Helen. There are various opinions if you go through a lot of the articles that are on about this specific piece. But whether these secularists disagree or not, I don't think it matters. But again, an example which I find really interesting. This stuff will come into play in the future, in future points coming up. Here's another one in which we see almost statues that look enclosed in a diptych. I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know if there's disagreements on how to pronounce it. But here's some basic info. The Harborville triptych is a Byzantine ivory triptych of the middle of the 10th century with the Deesis and other saints. And if you don't know, the Deesis is where Christ is sitting in the middle. It's a certain icon format where Christ is sitting in the middle and he's being adored. And usually the Theotokos and St. John the Baptist are motioning towards him. And now in the Loire, traces of coloring can be seen on some figures. So at one point it was painted. And it's the best preserved of the Romanos group of ivories from a workshop in Constantinople, probably closely connected with the imperial court. The group takes its name from the Romanos and Iodica ivory plaque in the cabinet. I don't know why I even attempt to read these, but here you go. You want to read about it, read about it. Here are some close-ups of the various carvings. And the back is interesting because it's sort of, it's almost an Antiochian Far East cross, which you see that the Syrian Church of the East nowadays use. But I thought it was interesting. It's not related, but really cool stuff. And some more close-ups. And why this is relevant, and I put this in the beginning of the stream for an important reason. And a lot of time, if you look into Western Rite Orthodoxy, you will see, especially in England, a lot of our priests using Gothic cathedrals and even Gothic vestments, and Gothic aesthetics, and so on and so forth. And I think there's a good reason for this. And as we will go on to see, I don't think that the Gothic period and the Romanesque periods, for that instance, are in any way corrupted or heterodox. I think they were an explication of orthodoxy, which happened when communion was very iffy at the time. But we're going to compare these to some other things which I think are beautiful. And again, we see this weird thing where, or do we really call these relief images or statues? I don't know. Obviously, a lot of the stuff in between the saints with the different biblical scenery we would say as relief images. But do we call these statues if they're connected, if they're glued down, if they're glued in the back? How much of the back has to be glued? I don't know. But this is sort of one of the beautiful examples, and again comes back to the idea of restoring the restoring aspect and the reincorporating aspect when it comes to the Western Rite. Where there are things which are explicated within pre-schism Rome, which are not heretical, which are beautiful, in which I think are proper. And again, we also this is from a medieval manuscript where they would illustrate the Mass, essentially, and ignore the unleavened bread. We're never using that. But things like this, where you have the altar and a statue of the Theotokos on the top, and sort of enthroned, or you have statues which are put in their own carved out, hollowed out areas, which again I think is a very sort of beautiful explication and a very proper usage of statuary, especially upon the altar. And we saw again from the altar in St. Apollinaris church in Ravenna, where they have the same sort of concept, where above the altar are the saints carved out in relief images. And it's almost uncanny. If we go back, ignore the flashing imagery, where we have both relief images and almost statues, we see the same thing explicated throughout the Romanesque and Gothic periods, which I think it's really cool. I think this stuff is really beautiful and reverent. We can even see the sort of relief images on the left as well. And combined with the ciborium, I think we get an interesting, and even rood screens and templons, we get a really interesting parallel to the Old Testament, a really interesting continuity, which is distinct from the Byzantine Rite, but ultimately comes from the same understanding. And I'll spam past. Here's another example. I think it's St. Peter in the middle with the key, obviously. And the Theotokos at the top. And then we have St. Peter, who's being crucified upside down, and various other saints and events, which all this seems quite proper to me personally. Some people might think it's a little crazy, but there are multiple Russian cathedrals and things that are a little bit overboard. But again, imagining this stuff within a Western Rite context, where we have iconography and a rood screen or a ciborium and a templon, and we have the curtains being pulled across, and we have the pre-Tridentine usage. I think, given the imagery of the temple with the statues and the altar and it being almost completely enclosed, with the imagery in the nave, it's very has a lot of continuity, I think. Very beautiful. Here are just some more examples. Again, ignore the unleavened bread. Where on the left we have the sort of English, and even in parts of Italy within pre-Tridentine Rome, you'll see the sort of curtains. You see this a lot, and I think I gave examples. Yeah, I gave examples in the last part of the video, where you have the curtains on the side with the angels on top, which again, we see this practice everywhere. And personally, in the Rocourt church that I go to, they have it's a church which has so much influence from both Roman worship, with the large Basilica dome with the Theotokos on the top, And then you have the iconostasis, which is very Antiochene in the way that it looks, which comes from when Antioch used ciboriums. And then we have the menorah on the altar, which comes from Jerusalem. And it's absolutely beautiful, and at certain times the priest turns the lights on and turns the lights off and closes the curtain and X, Y, and Z. And it's just sort of a beautiful continuity that we see with the Old Testament when things are explicated properly. Here are some examples of the tradition in Constantinople of making statuesque relief image. Continues within the Gothic period, which again, very beautiful, very interesting. And some more examples. And when you compare and contrast these things with what was done in a smaller sense, in a smaller scale within Constantinople, it seems a little bit less crazy and foreign. You could say it's excessive. I would accept that as valid. But as if this is a total innovation or craziness or something like that, I think really you couldn't hold to that consistently given these examples. And again, we have more ivory, which I think it's so strange that we see something in Constantinople, which I can't find many examples in Rome, aside from some of the examples I gave where they have coffins, which have these types of relief imagery. And some within the side altar of St. Apollinaris. And again, very interesting. And when you compare, these things, which I think these sorts of examples, you can't really look at these examples and say, oh, this is the Latins being fleshly, or the overemphasis on earthliness, or any sort of accusation you see a lot of the time when it comes to statuary, because they have a sort of distortion, I guess you could say, but with a less negative context, and are given almost an iconographic form, which sort of leaves a little bit of ambiguity, a little bit of otherworldliness to them, which we see in iconography a lot of the time as well. And we're going to go back to some of the other examples. And this is a cross, which is an Ottonian example. And if you ever look into the Ottonian era in Emperor Otto II and III, very interesting people, very interesting emperors, which have entire iconographic traditions associated with them. And this is another example that we'll find of a carved crucifix, which has become very popular. Here's some more close-ups. And again, we see the halo. We don't see any sort of extreme hanging or mortification upon the cross, which you see a lot of the time where they paint Christ or carve crucifixes where looks like he's been through a wood chipper, which is inappropriate and should not be hung up. But here we're going to get to some more relevant, interesting examples in which there's actually a statue within Greece, which is miracle working in Castoria. One of the most unique churches in Greece dating to the Roman times is the Church of St. George and the village of Omorfolk, 20 kilometers from Castoria. The name of the village means beautiful church. The church was established after 1292 during the reign of Emperor Alexandros II. The iconography dates to either 1296 or 1297. Some that say the church building itself or an earlier one existed from the 11th century. The rocks from which the church is built are not local. It is traditionally held that the church was the Cathalocian of an old monastery. The unique feature of this church is that it has a large wood-carved statue of St. George, which is 2.86 meters in height. That is of unknown origin. Some people say that the statue was a gift from the Emperor of Constantinople, either brought there or carved in the village from local trees. The most popular tradition states that 2 nuns brought the statue here from Ionia in the 13th century in a carriage. During the Turkish occupation of the church, it was heavily damaged, and yet it is said that when the local Ottomans went to burn down the church, they allowed the locals to remove the wooden statue of St. George, ensuring its preservation. The faithful claim that the statue of St. George is miraculous. A Greek news report was done about the miraculous nature of the statues, with many testimonies. These miracles especially are reported on the feast of the church, which is April 23rd. Along with miracles, visions of St. George are also said to have occurred in the church at one point. At one point, the faithful covered the statue with a glass casing to protect it from humidity and dust, but St. George appeared in the dreams of one of the faithful and asked them to remove it. An interesting folk belief, not necessarily associated with Orthodox belief, has arisen with the statue. Upon observation, you will see the statue covered with coins. The locals believe that if you approach the statue with firm faith in St. George, then your coin will stick as if it has magnets, as if magnets were holding it. Studies have shown, however, that there is nothing measurably magnetic about the wood-carved statue. No one really knows why this occurs, but it is looked upon as something miraculous, and visitors are discouraged from believing that if their coin does not stick, as it often happens, that their faith is not strong enough. They say that St. George has his reasons for it to stick and reasons for it not to stick. And here are some examples. It's placed usually where the bishop's throne is. Let's say the iconostasis. And here you can see the coin sticking, which is very interesting and joyous, to say the least. And next we have another example of a miracle-working statue from a monastery in Serbia. And the story goes, because I didn't write it down, but I have it memorized, is that the statue came from Constantinople and was placed in the monastery. And it is miraculous because a lot of women who are having issues conceiving will venerate the statue and will begin conceiving again, which is very interesting because there's a lot of biblical parallels, as with Samson's mother, or Hamps, or Hannah, or so on and so forth, where many women in the Old Testament miraculously had their wombs opened, which again we have paralleled in the statue. And people even make pilgrimages to it, and it is again venerated. And again we see this interesting trend where the statue is replaced within a carved out section, which is very interesting. And we even see the sort of dome which it is placed within being encoded in gold leaf. And again, interesting continuity that we see with the Old Testament. Very, very interesting continuity that we see with the Old Testament and of Orthodox doctrine and theology. And next, we are going to go through a big surprise to a lot of Orthodox, and especially Orthodox converts, which this is the main reason why I remade this video, because this was such a large find that I was just absolutely amazed. And that is that before the Bolshevik Revolution, and even certain tsars which outlawed the making of statuary, there were massive amounts, and I mean absolutely massive amounts of statues within Orthodox churches, especially on iconostasis, but as we go through the presentation, we will even see ones that are located outside of the iconostasis and venerated individually. And when looking up this art gallery which displays them, which is where the Bolsheviks put these statues, and even entire iconostasis, you will see or come across the fact that the Russian Orthodox Church has petitioned this museum to give them back their statues, so much to the point that the officials of the museum fear that the museum will go out of business because there are so many statues. There are reports saying they have upwards of 500 or more examples of these statues, which were placed in Orthodox churches, which is absolutely astounding. And we're going to go into examples. And a lot of people at first glance are going to become very, very reactionary, to say the least, with this one example. We have a statue of God the Father on the left. And an example of relief slash statuary. I'm just calling it a statue. You can argue whether or not the back's flat. It's a statue. Multiple statues of Christ being taken down from the cross. And here is sort of a wide shot angle of many of the examples within this museum in which they have statues of Christ. And this is actually a quite interesting example where we have a statue being given its own ciborium, being encased in glass, almost like as a relic, which I think is sort of important when we look at these things, because even within the early church, we don't see that many references to veneration of imagery. But what we do find is the veneration, I guess you could say, of relics, and the miracles of relics, and the attestation of relics within the early church fathers, which I ultimately believe that the argument that us as Orthodox should be making against those who deny the veneration of iconography is that it's a natural extension of our beliefs about relics. And I think that's ultimately where it came from, and it's not some just pagan innovation that so many Protestants who think they understand the early church state. But ultimately within the Bible, grabbing the cloth and becoming miraculously healed. I think that's sort of very significant, where we see a bodily action being made to get closer towards God and miracles being worked from it. Which, again, very interesting things. We even see angels atop the ciborium, which, again, is so interesting, and seraphim relief images coming out of the roof of the ciborium. Very interesting. Here's some other angles. Another angle of the statue of God the Father. And some angels on the left. Multiple examples. Here's another statue of God the Father, which was placed at the top of an iconostasis. Here is a statue of a saint, which I do not know because they're not all labeled, and the photos which I have found. And here is a close-up of the statue of the Crucifixion with St. John and the Theotokos, and we can even see the angels up top, and this one is even carrying an altar fan, a Byzantine altar fan. Some examples of the golden doors being adorned with statuary. Very interesting. Another example, and you see this a lot in Orthodox iconography, especially Russian, when you have God the Father at the top, the sun and the moon, in Christ, and the Theotokos and St. John, and Adam's skull at the bottom. And here's another saint. Don't know who it is, but it even has an icon at the top, which I find very interesting, very cool. Here is a stand, which I'm guessing this is one of the stands in which they used to read the gospel from, which is adorned with statuary. We see an interesting trend where they sort of use statues like pillars and like architectural features and icons at the same time, which is very interesting. Just a thing to point out. Here's a closer up photo. You'll actually find this photo on the English internet, but you won't find a lot of other photos within English websites. Because again, I had to go to the Russian internet through Yandex and to then translate it through Google Translate to get really broken up Google Translate results. It's hilarious, to say the least. And more examples. And here's the head of St. John the Baptist. This is beautiful. If you hate this, if you think this should be burned, I don't know what's wrong with you. And here's an example where they took an entire iconostasis and put it within a museum, where it has statues on top, and the context where some of these, not all of them, but a lot of them, were in, where they were atop iconostasis, or part of the iconostasis, and so on. And here is within their collection, which is not all public, where they have them all numbered out with a myriad of examples. Absolutely everywhere. And no, it is not Roman Catholic statuary. It is all Orthodox. The museum title is even called the Orthodox Museum of Statuary. In the name. You could very easily argue that it is Roman Catholic influenced. But the dates to which these all come from are from the 17th century onwards. Which I think, I don't think you can make the argument that these things could become so prevalent within the church just to be sort of heretical innovations. I don't think, I really truly believe that when Christ says that the church will be led unto all truth, that it means that you can't just have an entire jurisdiction, entire diocese, an entire massive area of Orthodox Christians just become completely corrupt, or just having heresy or things that are improper being propagated through it. I think it's a very wrong argument that does not really put you in an argument, in a place to argue for orthodoxy in general. And we see the traditional Russian 3-bar cross everywhere. In traditional Orthodox iconography explicated upon the statues. Again, continuity. More examples, and more examples, and more examples. I hope someone's counting out there, man. The one in the middle is my favorite, where it has carved angels, which are, I think, supposed to be cherubim, and icons on it. We have an icon of God the Father at the top, icon of the Theotokos and St. John to the left and to the right, and completely surrounded by statues of cherubim. On the right, we see the bottom bar of the cross, which is standard in Russian iconography, and in Orthodox iconography in general nowadays. Here's one of the sculptures that was labeled. In here are all the links. Have fun with these links. Go through them. Use Google Translate to translate them. And the next thing we're going to get to, because again, there's not just one museum that has these examples of statuary. They're very prevalent in Russia, but no one likes to talk about it for whatever reason, is the fact that St. Nil Stolobensky actually is pictured in statuary, and I actually personally have a statue of Saint Nil in my icon corner, which I had ordered from an Orthodox iconographer who started doing carvings. But you can see there are many examples, and these examples go for auction a lot. And you can buy these online, even though the antique ones are very, very, very expensive, but are even present to the point where people are selling them. But these are very common in monasteries, especially the monasteries in which he attended, or he was a part of, and in the surrounding areas. And very interesting stuff. You can do a basic Google search on this one. I'm not going to give you a million links. And next we have a statue of St. John, Bishop of Novgorod, which was actually housed in the St. Sophia Cathedral. And on the left I have a Russian iconographic site, which has the more information about it. Here's another example, which I think is hilarious. We have statues of the Trinity. And again, you can make the argument from the captivity within Russia, but again, these things can't be prevalent for 300 years and have it be heresy. Or even more, and have it just everywhere, and still having cathedrals, which are in usage that have statuary, and then have miracles of statuary, and then have early church references to miracles of statuary, and then St. John of Damascus defending statuary. You just can't. I don't think you can coherently make the argument anymore, you know? Here are some examples of how statues were used within that 300-year period, which are still around and were not affected by communism. You can see at the top where they have the statues atop the iconostases. And here's another one. And there's even websites that you can buy Orthodox statues. They're very expensive, I will admit that. But there are plenty of churches in which these statues are present. We have St. Isaac's Cathedral. It was unorthodox, so on and so forth. Not gonna work this time, buddy old. Which are still around. Just massive. So does this stuff look, out of place, or does the Gothic stuff look out of place? How can we say that the Gothic examples are crazy, heretical innovations that are ugly when you have this stuff everywhere? And again, I provided plenty of evidence that this was more than prevalent, and I provided more than enough resources. And here's an example of a statue in which it is present nowadays within a cathedral, and it is even venerated. In the Transfiguration of the Savior Church, there's a unique wooden statue, which is more inherent in the decoration of Catholic cathedrals and unusual for Orthodox Christians. The sculpture, created by a rural craftsman from solid linden in the 17th century, again, early example, 600s, depicted Jesus Christ wearing a crown of thorn on the night before the crucifixion in the temple. It is located to the right of the altar in a niche. And next to the statue are slippers, a lot of slippers. He walks around the temple, Savior, and grieves for us sinners, so he has to change his slippers every day. Father George explains to me with a bright smile. According to believers, the slippers that have been on the feet of the Savior midnight have healing powers. They especially help against disease of the feet. Therefore, parishioners regularly bring slippers to the temple and collect them. The Lord heals people. Today, a parcel arrived with slippers from Sergiev, Posad. We will try it on the Savior and send it back. In continuation of the conversation. Almost 20 years later, Anton, the assistant to the current abbot of Father Alexander, told me. So, we have another tradition, almost like uncannily similar to the statue closely outside of Castoria, where we have small miracles on a small sense. The statue is enclosed and is placed in the side of a church where it's venerated, and people treat it like a miraculous icon almost. And this is something interesting, but the reliquary of Saint Helen, Constantine's mother, is actually statuesque in nature, which is very, very cool. And this is a statue of the Theotokos in a rural Orthodox church in Russia. Again, there's not much information about this, even in Russian, that I can find. There's only a few references to this specific statue that I can find in general. And here's a statue of St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker in St. Peter and Paul's Cathedral in Mitsensk. And lastly, before I end this part of the video, because I'm tired, haven't had that great of a day, I'm going to play a service for a statue that is in a Russian church.
Благословен Бог наш всегда, ныне и присно и во веки веков. Радуйся с предвечным Богом младенцем в Назарет пришедшее, радуйся таинству спасения рода человеческого послужившее, радуйся лествице ею же восходим от земли на небо, радуйся всему миру придимой покрове, радуйся, яко с верою поклоняемся пречистого лика Твоего изображению, радуйся, яко от Него приемлем благодатные дары во спасение душ наших.
Сестры, прихожане, труженики, гости, обители. Я поздравляю всех с праздником Условной Пресвятой Владычицы нашей Богородицы, с праздником и образа Божией Матери прибавления ума. Как сказано было в молитве, дай Бог нам всем ума, но только на пользу, потому что еще бывает горе от ума, что от чего избавиться, наверное, тяжелее. Поэтому помогай вам Бог, будьте всегда под покровом Божией Матери, старайтесь всегда там быть. Делайте все для этого, и помогай вам всем Бог, здоровья, счастья, всех умственных и творческих успехов.
Надо ей показать эту веточку.
Alright, I'm back after recording this section of the video for the third time. I'm getting very tired, so I'm probably going to cut this as short as I can and go through this as short as I can, because I've literally done this video 3 times, and OBS refused to record every time. So this is the third part of the presentation. I'm going to breeze through this because I've been doing this for 2 hours and it won't record properly. But now it's finally recording. So sorry if I breeze past this, but we're going to get to the modern Western Rite usage. And here is an altar which has a statue of Our Lady of Walsingham on it. It is an old calendar jurisdiction, but nonetheless, I believe this is an appropriate usage of statuary because we have multiple pre-schism examples of it. Here's a wider angle shot. And here is a Marion Altar on the left, which has a statue of the Theotokos and the Christ Child. And this is a common practice to where you have a Marion altar on the left to the altar, and you have an entire altar dedicated to her, which I like. I think it's very nice. Marian veneration, very good. Protestants, bad. Here's a Our Lady of Walsingham statue on the altar, on the side altar in St. Augustine's. And here is another altar statue on the main altar of the Virgin of the Rule shrine in Miami, Florida, which is Antiochian. And here is St. Augustine's Church from a wider angle at a very bad resolution. Couldn't find any better photos, so sorry about that one. And here is a video from the Cistercian Rochor Abbey in Germany. And Father or Abbot Thomas is going to sing the Salve Regina to the Theotokos through the statue of the Theotokos, which is present. And if you watch this video and even after watching this whole video still hate the Western Rite, still hate statuary and X, Y, and Z dumb objection, I don't know what to say to you. You might as well just leave. I don't know why you watched this much of this video if you still hate it. Might as well just leave now. Don't stay for the rest, and just go to wherever else you want to go. But without further ado, here we go.
et animam dignum filii tui habitaculum effici miseretur, Spiritus Sancto cooperante preparavasti, Daut cuius commemoratione lectamur, eos dia intercessione ab instantibus malis, et a morte perpetua liberebur, per iundem Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen.
Alright, so again, after watching that, you still don't like presentation, still don't like statues, just skedaddle. Thanks. Stop that. Alright. And next, we're going to go to the most common objections, and I'm not even going to read these. I've read these multiple times, and it wouldn't record, so we're going to glance over this. I'm just going to go again over my responses and some basic summaries. He distinguishes between statues, idols, and icons, and goes on to states that the church does not manufacture them, which the claim that the church does not manufacture or adorn statuary is false. So I've proven in my presentation that have been statues both in liturgical and non-liturgical / semi-liturgical devotional settings throughout. Although not common or as widespread as iconography, statues, including miracle-working statue, has been present in churches, especially in the West, and even in catacomb and patristic periods. It goes on to state that because the council does not mention statues, means it's antagonistic. I admit that the council does not mention statues. I do not claim that statues were prevalent within the church, but I don't believe it's antagonistic. I think they were just simply giving examples of what they believe to be appropriate to have have icons made out of. Also wanted continue. He goes on to state that no one mentions statues throughout iconoclasm, and ultimately I think it's because iconoclasts don't think statues and icons are different. At all. They think they're the same thing, and we see this with a lot of modern Protestants who critique Roman Catholics, is that they think all of their images are just idolatry and X, Y, and Z, which is wrong, but I honestly think that iconoclasts thought the same thing. So if there was statues, I don't think they would in any way think that it was really any different. And given the examples of the Constantinopolitan ivory and St. John Chrysostom stating that there are statues in Constantinopolitan churches, I ultimately don't think that there is even too much of a visual distinction between icons and relief images and statues, and so thus I don't think they would have had this idea that they were different either. So ultimately, I don't think there would have been a reason for them to distinguish between them. I don't think either sides really thought that there was a real separation or distinction between icons and statues. And that's why I don't think it was brought up very much. But it was, again, brought up once. And statues were a Western phenomenon for the most part, even though there are notable exceptions. And those slide numbers are wrong because I added one in the back and I added a slide in the back, so it put them out of order. But you guys will find them. And also, on the contrary, Pope Gregory's correspondence with the iconoclast Emperor Leo III, he does threaten to destroy a statue in St. Peter's Basilica of St. Peter. I do admit that there isn't many references in iconoclasm, but there are references before and a lot of examples and references after that period of time. And he goes on to speak about the statue that Eusebius records, which you can pause this and read it. The statue was miracle working. It helped a woman who had an issue with some sort of blood issue, and people made pilgrimages to it, and a herb underneath the statue started healing people with medical illnesses. And the statue was moved within a church and was venerated, and people made pilgrimages to it. He goes on to state that this was essentially an exception because at the time Christianity was illegal, and it was sort of a persecuted type thing. He goes on to say that a woman was essentially ignorant of what was appropriate, and thus that's why God accepted it. But given the understanding of or the context within the church that I have now at my disposal, at my usage, I don't buy this argument because it hasn't happened once, at minimum of 3 times, depending on whether or not you accept it. It could be 4. So this example, the Soliac Virgin, the Holy George statue, and the Holy Face, or 4 minimum, where there have been miracles, and maybe 5 if we include Our Lady of Walsingham, commanded to be made by the Theotokos, and things like this. So when we have multiple examples, and then right after St. Nicodemus the Haggurite died, statues became so prevalent in Russia that there is a single statue in Perm which has over 500 of them. And the Russian church, even till today, is so fond of them that the museum may go out of business if the church gets its statues back, because the collection is so vast that that's all they have in that museum, which is miraculous to say the least. Extraordinary. Ultimately, I don't think that these arguments make very much sense now. But I think at the time they did, which is the perspective that he's coming from, is that he's probably seeing statues being used by Roman Catholics, and in no other context, which I think is what this is about, ultimately. And so I think, given his resources in the time period, it would have been sort of a reasonable opinion. I also want to say that I'm not denigrating St. Nicodemus the Haggurite because I disagree with him on this point. Because a lot of people who are against statuary are also against icons of God the Father. But St. Nicodemus the Haggurite supports icons of God the Father. Very much so, and as he states in other parts of the rudder. So I don't think because I'm disagreeing with him means that he's any less of a saint or anything. I just wanted to mention that. And next I'm going to do a basic treatise, a theological treatise on statuary, on the basis of standard Orthodox theology. For as Christ came incarnate in 3 dimensions, we can depict him in 3 dimensions. For if the bodiless powers of heaven, angels can be carved, thus can the angel of the Lord, for the angel of great counsel has been gifted. Does not adorning figures with gold reflect the ever-shining rays, or the 12 who worship the Lamb not engulfed in his gilded halo, for the intercessors are washed in his reflection. And you will see this trend within statuary where they're adorned in gold, which shows God's radiance radiating off of them. And a lot of people sort of describe the energies like a piece of iron being heated up in the flame. So they are not, God in and of themselves, but by virtue of participating in God. The iron rod is not the source of heat, or it is not hot in and of itself, but it derives its heat from the source, from the flame. I think the best arguments for statuary is ultimately the incarnation and the resurrection. Are we not resurrected from the ground in 3 dimensions? And when Christ became incarnate, did he not sanctify 3 dimensions? And when we are consistent with the fact that 2-dimensional objects don't actually exist within our universe, and that no icon is actually flat and not 3-dimensional, we sort of have to admit, if we're consistent, especially if we accept relief imagery, at what point does a relief image become a statue? Can someone give me a clear and concise point? How much, does it have to be attached to the feet? Does it have to be attached at the back? At what point? How many millimeters have to be carved around it? Ultimately, I don't think there is a real distinction. But one thing that I really want to emphasize is the fact that statues can sort of make our interpretations much richer, and they can give us more teaching tools. Say, if you see a statue of the crucifixion with the two other crosses and the Theotokos and St. John at the bottom of the cross, does it not give you this idea that these were real people, and this event was truly historical? A lot of the early Gnostics come close to affirming that Christ didn't exist. Well, does not having a statue of Christ in the crucifixion not say, oh, no, you're wrong and that's a stupid idea? It really did happen. When you see a statue of the cross and St. John and Theotokos, does it not give you the idea that this was a real historical event? And that we're worshiping a man, the God-man? Does it not give you that idea when you see a statue? And when you see a gilded saint, standing, or Christ holding a flag with his white robe, does that not symbolize the resurrection, the bodily resurrection of all men to you? I think it really does, and it can be a very good tool for, adorning the church and for teaching and for exemplifying certain aspects of the gospel. And when we get relief images, does it not sort of symbolize, the heavenly coming down and reaching their arm out when we have, relief images and statues which are enclosed? Does it not really symbolize the saints reaching out and influencing our lives, through the prayer, through the liturgy, Or when you have a set of the Nativity, does it not give you that idea, like, this is really, this is a thing that really happened. This is not just like an idea. It's not just some illusory thing. He wasn't just, it wasn't just a spiritual reality. This is a real historical event in which, Christ became crucified, Christ became incarnate, Christ became resurrected. All of these things, I think, are very important, extremely important to this. And could be used in so many ways which reflect Orthodox theology. I think, ultimately, after recording this for the third time, I think I'm done, and I'm so glad to be done. Thank you all for watching. You will see some more videos. I'm going to be doing a longer video with more historical context and patristics on icons of God the Father, and then on iconography and Judaism. Because contrary to choir belief, mosaics and iconography are very common in synagogues, even more than just the Dura Europa synagogue, because people point that out, but there's a lot more examples, especially in Galilee. And so look forward for that stuff. And as for now, thank everybody for watching this video. I hope it gets uploaded, and it'll be uploaded before Old Calendar Christmas. So this is everyone's Old Calendar Christmas present. But thank you all for watching. Please leave comments, and especially leave comments if you have any more examples of statues that I didn't find, or examples of patristic quotes, quoting statues, or things like this. So thank you all for watching, and God bless everyone. Have a nice day.